Hi. Hello everyone, my name is Gert-Jan Vanaken. I'm a PhD student with Professor Jens, and I'm very glad to be able to talk to you about environmental ethics, and more in particular about the Latin American philosophy of Buen Vivir, which we will address today as a case study, as a way to look at environmental ethics in particular. Environmental ethics is, as you know, it's a discipline closely aligned to bioethics, and that's why it also um, makes out a part of this course. And you might ask why are we addressing this one particular philosophy of Buen Vivir? Well, it starts from the idea that it would be interesting to bring in some alternatives, some non-Western, non-European views on ethics and on environmental ethics in this case. So that's a bit of the backstory. To to give you an idea what this course will be about, I'll first start with a more general part on environmental ethics. What are the broader questions that are being discussed in this academic field? And then I'll go more into the particulars of the particularities of Buen Vivir. Okay, but let's start with a case. I brought with me this case today, and it's the following. What you can see here is an almond farm, and as you know, almonds are nuts, and one of the main products that are made from these almonds is almond milk, which is increasingly popular. And almond trees, almond farms, you can mainly find them in California, United States, where the climate is ideal for these kind of crops. But what you need to know about these almond farms is that the flowers of these trees, they need to be pollinated by bees, and it's this pollination is very needed. It's even there are even 10 times more bees needed to pollinate almond trees than to pollinate apple trees, for example. But there's a particular issue. Since a couple of years, the beekeepers that bring in their bees in spring and in summer, they notice that large parts of their bee population, they die over the season when they are pollinating these almond trees, and this is what researchers have called the colony collapse disorder. And some reasons that we can think of why this is happening is that there is very limited biodiversity in these areas of almond farms. So bees have little opportunities to find opportunities to feed them besides the flowers and the almond trees. Also because bees are concentrated with big amounts in these areas in California. It's easy for diseases to spread between the bees, and of course on these industrial plantations, pesticides are used, which might also be toxic for the bees. So what happens? The beekeepers, every year they see their colonies slashed with over half of their bees, and the year after they have to come back with new bees. And so for the beekeepers, this is a significant problem. You can see a picture of such a beekeeper here. And we could ask ourselves the question, and this is the type of questions that are being asked in the field of environmental ethics: how should we approach this issue? And if we would do this during a physical class, I would ask you to discuss a bit with your neighbor how to deal with this yearly mass die-off of bees. Which proposals do you have, and argue a bit why this is happening. Also now I would like to ask to pause this video for a minute and think a bit what you think that should happen. What are the problems, and what could be solutions? Okay, go ahead and just continue if you're ready. Okay, so some things that you might have been thinking of is that for the beekeepers this is a real problem because they have financial losses if they lose large portions of their populations. They have to invest in regenerating those bee populations. So that could be one of the arguments that you put that you use to argue that some things should change. But other people might argue that also it's unethical to send in those bees into the almond farms, knowing that they will die off, and that you will have to bring in new bees the year after. So that the bees in themselves are an argument, or the health of those bees are an argument in themselves to think of changing those almond farms, to make it smaller farms, to bring in more biodiversity, to use less pesticides, and approaches like these. And I'm using this example because it's exemplary of the main questions that are being addressed in environmental ethics. And what are those questions? Well, traditionally, environmental ethics have been thinking of the following things. Which obligations do humans have towards non-human life, towards the natural environment? And more in particular, why do we have those obligations? And when we're thinking about these questions, ethicists have argued that the distinction comes down to the following. It comes down to defining what kind of value that we attribute to non-human life and our natural environment. And some have argued that non-human life, that the environment merely has instrumental value, which means that it has certain value as a means to further human interests, as a means to further other ends. Or other people have argued that non-human life also carries intrinsic value, that objects or non-human life is valuable as an end in themselves, regardless of what function that they serve. And if we think back of the example of the bees in the almond farm, we can think of the bees as being instrumental in for human agriculture, as they serve as pollinators for the almond trees, and that our obligations towards these bees are rather indirect. So to say, we only have certain obligation to protect those bees, since they have a function for us as humans. While if some of you may have also argued that bees in themselves should be protected, that we cannot just send them into the almond farms and let them die. No, we also have, the bees can also have an intrinsic value, which give rise to more direct moral obligations to protect, or at least not to damage this form of non-human life. And this is, broadly speaking, a large distinction that is being made in environmental ethics, whether non-human life and natural environment has merely instrumental value, or if it also has intrinsic value. And this brings us to two big theoretical strands in environmental ethics. being an anthropocentrist view versus an ecocentrist view. And I'll be presenting them as two contrasting views for the sake of making the distinction clear. But of course, you can argue that the borders between those two views are not so easy to draw. But let me talk you through it a bit. An anthropocentric view puts human interests as center stage, and it considers human life as unique in its intrinsic value, and all the obligations that we have towards our environment, towards plants and insects, towards animals, they only reach so far as to preserve the instrumental value of non-human life into our natural environment with regards to humans. And there are stronger formulations and weaker formulations of this anthropocentric view. But what is essential is that it puts human interest center stage. An opposing view is the one of ecocentrism, which acknowledges that argues that there's also value to be found, intrinsic value to be found in non-human life and in the natural environment, and as such that we should not only care about which service, for example, the rainforest could offer humans, but that also protecting, for example, the Amazonian forest can be argued for because of the intrinsic value of this element of our natural environment. Of course, this brings new questions to the foreground, and I'll address, or I'll give some examples of how to answer these questions when we'll discuss the philosophy of Buen Vivir. And such questions are, for example, if we attribute value to plants, to animals, to trees, to forests, to ecosystems, then how can we still make difference between forms of life? Does a fly has the same rights to be protected as your pet, as your dog that you have at home, for example? Or can we still make, within an ecocentric view, can we still make differences between different species, between different forms of life? And another question could be, if we attribute intrinsic value towards each living being and each aspect of the natural environment, then how is it still possible to live? Because to be able to eat, we actually thrive on other organisms. We actually eat our organisms. We are dependent on our natural environment. How can we actually deal with those kind of questions? When talking about Buen Vivir, I'll give some. I'll try to give some answers to that. So this broadly gives you an introduction of the main questions that are being addressed in the field of environmental ethics. What has intrinsic value, what has instrumental value, anthropocentric view versus an ecocentric view. The second set of questions that I would like to address, I'd like to introduce, concern the topic of environmental justice. Environmental justice is a principle that doesn't really find its origins in the academic field of environmental ethics, but finds its origins more into social movements that have been addressing this topic. And what is it about? Well, if we assume that our environment and that non-human life um, delivers services to us humans, that as humans um, we need air to breathe, we need clean water to drink, uh, we need food to eat, then we can also ask questions about how to distribute these environmental services and how to distribute the burdens if these environmental conditions are lacking. And if they are lacking, who has the obligation to take care of a flourishing environment that we all need? Okay, it might still be a bit abstract, but let me give an example to make this clear. The origins of this concept of environmental justice, they can be found in a particular case in the United States. It's the case of the Law of Canal, and this story takes place at the end of the 1970s. And what happened is actually the following. Near the Niagara Falls in the United States, there at the end of the 19th century, actually, there was a canal being dug with the goal to make a hydropower plant using this canal. But after a couple of years, apparently the finance didn't work out right, and they couldn't actually build this power plant. But the canal already was there. And in the early 20th centuries, between 1920 and 1943, the canal was being used or was put to offer to the upcoming chemical industry in this area, and they could use it as a dump, as a waste dump for the chemical waste that they produced. So for 30 years, the canal was being filled with chemical waste, and once all space was taken, the industries decided to simply cover the canal. And some time passed by, and for one reason or the other, the local community decided or the local government decided to buy this ground and to start building houses and to start building an elementary school on top of this. Not expensive houses, but houses for people of a working class background. And as you can already feel it coming, a couple of years passed, 20 years passed, and by the end of the 1970s, people started to notice that, people in this village started to notice that there was a significant amount of birth defects and people having respiratory illnesses. And what happened, of course, after all these years of rain and erosion, the chemical waste came to the surface and started to affect the health of the people living there. The communities, or some people in the community, started to organize themselves, and they came to understand that it was no coincidence that it was the houses for people of a working class background that were actually being built in an environment that was polluted. And this linking of being part of a marginalized group in society and having to bear the burdens of a hostile environment were being linked, and it's in this case that the principle of environmental justice came into being. And after this event, many more communities all over the world started organizing following this principle. And I won't go into more details, but if you're interested in this topic, there is a very fine online atlas, the Environmental Justice Atlas, that makes an overview of an overview of struggles being fought around the world around this principle. And more recently, of course, this principle was also being applied to issues around climate change, formulating the principle of climate justice. And also here there are interesting examples of how the principle of justice is being aligned with environmental issues. I won't go over these first two examples. You can look into them yourself if you're interested. In this one, maybe one example is makes a good case, and it's the following. In Groningen, in the Netherlands, as you know, maybe it's a northern province of Netherlands. Since many years, there is fossil gas being extracted from the ground in Groningen. And what happens is that over the years, when the gas resources started to decline, people living there started to notice that an increasing amount of earthquakes, large and small, was happening. And of course, quickly the link was being made and also scientifically accepted that extracting gas from the underground was actually causing these earthquakes that caused and still causing damage to the houses of people living there. And also there people started organizing around a principle of justice, because what is happening, there are who is actually extracting the gas there, who is actually profiting from the extraction of gas. It is the Dutch government who is doing this process in collaboration with two major oil and gas companies, being Shell and ExxonMobil. At the same time, for people living there, they are confronted with damages to their houses, and they are experiencing a lot of difficulties in actually getting their expenses being paid back to the government. And so also here you have clearly this element of who is actually benefiting from the services that our environment can offer. In this case, the government, the oil and gas companies are clearly profiting, while other people, being local residents, are actually carrying the burden. And this is also an element that will come back when we're discussing the philosophy of Buen Vivir. So there was my introduction in the field of environmental ethics. We've been talking about anthropocentric versus ecocentric views, and we have been talking about the principle of justice, who is actually how are we actually distributing the benefits and the burdens of the services that our environment have on offer. So for the second part of this course, let's dive into the concrete example of Buen Vivir, which is an example of a way of putting ecocentric ethics into practice. When I talk about Buen Vivir, we first need to know a bit what do these words actually mean. And as you might know, Buen Vivir is Spanish for good life or good living. And it's a concept that's not easily defined, and if you would look up a definition, it would maybe always start with saying, okay, it is Spanish for the good life, but that's not enough as a translation. It has more layers of meaning. So I'll try to give you some insights on what those different layers of meaning actually are. Broadly speaking, it is a worldview, it's an ethics, it's also a political platform that formulates a critique and also an alternative to the Western idea of development. It has its origins and is being developed in Latin America, and it's not just a utopic way of thinking. No, it also made its way, and that's a very concrete contribution, made its way into the constitutions, the relatively young constitution, new constitutions of the Latin American countries, Ecuador and Bolivia. And in trying to define Buen Vivir, it's also good that also those Spanish words in themselves are a translation of an indigenous concept. This is important because later on I will try to tell you that various elements of older indigenous knowledge, the indigenous people in the Andes and in the Amazonian regions, are truly embedded in this platform of Buen Vivir. So it means, it refers to the good life, the good living, but in a very broad sense. In a certain way, could compare it to our idea of quality of life, but with a couple of remarks. When we think of quality of life, or at least I think mostly about my personal quality of life. But Buen Vivir, in the Buen Vivir sense, the good life would refer to life in community, life in relationship, rather than individual quality of life. Secondly, community would also be would be seen as a broadened community that also takes into consideration the non-human life and the environment as elements that are part of the community. And the third element is that this good life is also grounded to a specific territory. It's about people trying to find ways to live on the place where they live. And this is also one of the reasons why the philosophy of Buen Vivir is not trying to reach out to other continents or to colonize the ideas of other of people around the world. No, it's a specific attempt of living the good life given the very specific the very specifics of the places where they live. And so bringing all of this together, maybe a better translation of Buen Vivir would be not just the good life of the good living, but good living together, or good living in harmony, life in community, community expanded to our to non-human life, to the environment, and grounded to a specific territory. As I said, it has its Buen Vivir has its origins in Latin America, and especially in the country of Ecuador. And I'll show you a map to give you a bit of idea where this is situated. That might be helpful. And I think what's good to know about Buen Vivir is that it has its origins, or that it originated as conceptually in the early 2000s, and that it combines two things. It combines, on the one hand, and we'll go a bit more into detail about that, it combines very present-day critique of the economics and the politics and the ethics of present day in, for example, Ecuador, but it it also embeds much older knowledge, indigenous knowledge. I'm just correcting a small typo here. All right. So, what is this present-day critique? To know that, we need to look a bit into what is actually what has been going on in Latin America over the past decades. And Latin America countries have seen between the 70s and the 90s the steep rise of neoliberal politics, which have been pushed by Western nations, which have been pushed by organizations, international organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And it's the kind of politics that tries to make government as small as possible, to try to run the country and the government as an enterprise, as a company, and to open up the markets, the national markets, to international players, to international companies. And in this period, many multinational companies have come to countries such as Ecuador to go after the natural resources that are present there. But of course, it's maybe. And in any ways, what happened after these decades of neoliberal politics, of austerity measures in the social sector, of rising poverty rates, there has been a counter movement, a counter action in the 1990s and the years 2000, which has been called the rise of the new left, which can be seen or which is characterized by new political parties, new politicians that wanted to address the social inequalities, the high poverty rates that have been created by those neoliberal politics. But also those governments of new left that we've seen in different countries in Latin America, they as well thought it was important to make use of the natural resources in their countries and to push, for example, for gold and silver mining, for fossil fuel extraction, for agriculture at large scale, at the deforestation to sell the valuable wood, because it would be necessary to extract these natural resources, to foster economic growth, to develop the country. And what's the difference between those years of neoliberal politics versus those years of the new left politics is that in the latter, the idea was, okay, we need to go through this phase of development so we can use the profits that we make to distribute within our population to address, for example, poverty in the country. And to give a concrete example of what it looked like, these are some examples of, for example, a gold mine and the picture on top. And another set of pictures which make clear what has been going on for the past years in a country such as Ecuador. We see on top an oil barrel marked by Texaco, by the American oil major, while we see below we see the oil tanks of Petroecuador, the state-owned oil company. And if we take all of this together, we see that those countries in Latin America, they have been exposed to this, what is called in Spanish, extractivismo, which is this ongoing extraction of national resources for the idea of stimulating the economy, of developing a nation, of becoming from a low towards a middle, towards a high income nation, and to make this progress over the years. This has been the story that has been told over and over again, while at first it was mainly told in a neoliberal narrative of markets that need to be opened up, while later on the same story has been told using a more progressive narrative, saying that we need to extract those resources in order to address, for example, poverty, to have money to educate people, to organize healthcare. But the baseline that people have been, the baseline is that resource extraction has been going on for decades, and actually even centuries in those countries. And this is the backdrop against which Buen Vivir is actually agitating. It has been seeing that despite the changing of the narratives, this idea of we need to develop the country, we need to develop our economy, has been put center stage, and our natural environment has mainly been seen as an instrument to serve this human development. So this is the critique against development, both in a more right-wing and development in a more left-wing version. This has been the critique that Buen Vivir is formulating. A second element which is important is the indigenous knowledge which is being embedded in the philosophy of Buen Vivir. And one of the examples that I find interesting is that people have been implementing the idea of circular, non-linear time, which actually comes down to the following. It is the idea that we as a society are not always trying to make progress, make our way with inventing new technology, making our way from a low to a middle to a high income country, always trying to progress. No, it's rather the idea that life is not a straightforward process going from E to B, but rather a continuous stream of interactions, an endless process of reciprocity. And indigenous people are also interpreting natural phenomenon in this sense. To give for example, to give one example, within this circular concept of time, if we would look, for example, at the life of a tree, then the death of a tree would not be an end in such a circular concept of time. No, it would. The death of a tree would just be a new beginning. tree would decompose and provide resources for the soil to regenerate again and to reproduce life. And as such, there is not a clear beginning and an end, but all elements are rather embedded within a more dynamic process. And also from this nonlinear concept of time, critique is formulated against more Western notions of development, of the need to transform a country from a low income to a high income country. And so that is, largely speaking, the critique that Buen Vivir is trying to formulate. What is it suggesting then? And I won't go into much detail about all of it, but what's good to know is that Buen Vivir is not a fixed text. It's not a definite set of policy proposals. It's definitely not a finished work. It's rather a glass half full that can still be still be filled further. But it has some clear ideas about what economy should look like, about what politics should look like, and it definitely has a clear idea on how we as humans should relate to non-human life and to our natural environments, and it builds as such on a philosophy of ecocentrism. And it's on the latter that I like to talk a bit more, because what's interesting with this philosophy of Buen Vivir is that it's, as I said earlier, it's not just a nice way of thinking. It's not just a philosophical enterprise. No, it also reached some tangible results. And a clear way in which people in Ecuador, people in Bolivia managed to materialize those ideas of ecocentrism is that they managed to formulate what is called the rights of nature. So how did that actually go? Well, and I'm speaking now of Ecuador. It's in 2006. There came the idea of drafting a new constitution, and this came after really a period of political crisis. I've told you a bit about the political history of the country, and to try to get out of this crisis, there was the idea of drafting a new constitution, and over the next 2 years, people took time to draft this new constitution, and many different groups in society took part in that. Not only the legal scholars, not only the politicians, but also indigenous people took part in it. Indigenous people which have been feeling the consequences of extractivism, of their shrinking living environments. Also, those people have been part of the process. And one of the key people in this process was Alberto Acosta, and in the end I'll refer to a book by him, which I find very, very interesting myself. And in this process, the ideas of Buen Vivir and ultimately the rights of nature were addressed. And this Alberto Acosta, he formulated it as following. He argued that after giving going through the history of giving rights to certain marginalized groups, such as the struggle for women's rights. Now the time became rights to extend rights not only to human people but also to nature as such. And I'll give some more details about what that actually looks like to give rights to nature. But anyways, the process went on, and in 2008, a new referendum was held, and with the rather large majority, the new constitution was being accepted and implemented. Now, what makes this interesting is that the constitution actually starts by saying that nature shall be subject of rights, which actually means, or what comes down to, that they're not just environmental principles that should be respected in the country, but know that actual people can go to court to defend the rights of nature in and of themselves. For example, in our country, if to give an easy example, if rivers are polluted, and you can go to court and argue that your drinking water as such is polluted, and that you as a human being are feeling the consequences of this pollution, and you can try to go to court to settle this issue with the people that are polluting the river. What you can do in Ecuador is not just going to judge to defend your environmental rights as a person. No, you can also go to court in name of this river in and of themselves, no matter if it causes any harm to human. You can go to court to defend the rights and to defend the rights of not to be polluted in and of themselves. Further on in the Constitution, it is also defined, as we saw earlier, that there is a right for integral respect for the existence of life cycles, of structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. And this is a clear translation of the ecocentric view that also non-human life and a natural environment has intrinsic value. Another interesting formulation is that in Ecuador, nature has the right to be restored, which is clearly different from environmental rights as we know them, for example, in our country. To go back to the example of a polluted river, if you would go to courts in Belgium arguing that your drinking water is being polluted, then you as an individual can, if you win the case, you can be recompensated for the harm that you experienced. You can get, for example, a financial recompensation. What can happen in Ecuador is that you can go to the judge to defend the rights of the river itself, and that nature in this particular river has a right to be restored, which is clearly a step further than just recompensating the disadvantages that humans have experienced. A last thing that I wanted to say about these rights of nature in the Constitution of Ecuador is that these rights do apply to, and you can see this in the Article 73, is that these rights apply to species, to ecosystems, and to natural cycles. And I think this is an interesting notion, but also an important thing to know that these rights actually apply to dynamic systems and not to individual animals, individual elements of our natural environment, individual plants, but actually refer to these living systems. And that's an interesting aspect of the ecocentric philosophy of Buen Vivir. As such, it is not a claim for a virgin or a pristine form of nature. It is not saying that humans can no longer, for example, do agriculture because it would violate a certain plant or a certain piece of land. But it is a fundamental recognition of the value of each and every form of life as not just in itself as an individual element, but as a contribution to a larger whole. And as such, it recognizes that also human life, or at least the good living together, the Buen Vivir, is deeply entangled with these natural systems. As such, from this ecocentric view, there arises an obligation not to protect every single animal, every single plant, every single tree, but there is an obligation to restore and to protect the reproduction of life and its systems. Another example of how the ideas of Buen Vivir played out in practice is what happened in the Yasuni Project. What is this about? Well, in the early 2000s, it was discovered that in a specific part of Ecuadorian rainforest, there would be there was made a discovery of a significant oil reserve, and this was situated in the Yasuni rainforest, and this part of the Ecuadorian rainforest is known by biologists worldwide as one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. So clearly you see the issues coming, and at the time being, there was this president Rafael Correa in Ecuador, part of this new left type of politics, arguing that the extraction of these oil reserves would clearly be needed to develop the country, to have money to distribute within the population, to address poverty in the country. And of course, this when this came into public discussion, there was also opposition. But well, what could we actually do? I would like to think you a bit of this. If you would be, let's say, a member of an advisory board of the Ecuadorian government, what would you advise, and try to argue a bit why? Again, take some time to think of this, and when you're ready, just go on with the video. All right. Well, what happened, of course, a lot of opposition from indigenous communities living exactly at this place in neighborhood in rainforest. Of course, a lot of opposition from environmental NGOs active in the country. But in an effort to overcome this this debate, there was a proposition made clearly embedded in the philosophy of Buen Vivir. The following proposition was made. Was an idea to actually leave the oil, all of the 800 billion barrels of oil that were discovered, to leave them in the ground, using arguments of protection of the indigenous land, the indigenous people, protection of the biodiversity being present in the region, of course, also reasons of climate concerns, and using the arguments of starting to get, as a country, more independent of the continuous extraction of natural resources. But the innovative turn here is that in return, Ecuador would try to collect $2.6 billion from the international community to use it to restore its natural environments and to invest in renewable energy, to invest in more ecologically sustainable forms of farming, in general, to make the transition of being an extractivist country to becoming an ecological sustainable country in the spirit of Buen Vivir. And so it happened like this. There was this proposal being made, and Ecuador and its officials made a big international tour to try and collect this money. And this is actually where the principle of environmental justice kicks in again, because the argument was being made, okay, why should we, as a small country in Latin America, feel the hard consequences of oil extraction, while we know that actually this oil will be used in worldwide, but mainly in richer countries, and why should we and arguing that also in richer countries, in Western countries, that there is a responsibility to contribute to making the ecological transformation in countries such as Ecuador. And while at the beginning there was a lot of enthusiasm about this idea, and maybe also good to say that this amount of money, the 2.6 billion, is only a fragment. It's less than half of the money that Ecuador would raise if they actually would extract all the oil and sell it on the international market. In the beginning there was a lot of enthusiasm, but in the end they didn't reach at all the target that was being set for numerous reasons. And in the end, the Ecuadorian government, they decided to go on with the extraction of the oil resource, which is speaking 2020 is taking place right now. but I'm still giving this example because although it didn't prove effective, it might inspire, of course, might still inspire future events. But it has clearly embedded in its basics this an ecocentric view on environmental ethics, combined with an environmental justice approach that tries to share the benefits and the burdens of environmental services. If we, and yeah, maybe also to quickly give, on a more positive note, give some tangible results of the implementation of these rights to nature in the Ecuadorian constitution. After this new institution came into being, it also had some international consequences. For example, on water, there's clear segments in the Ecuadorian constitution that frees water from commerce, and that also defines water as indispensable for all forms of life, not only human life. And together with some other Latin American countries, it could use the implementation of these elements in their constitution to argue within the United Nations for a human right to water, which has been extremely effective. And in 2010, this has been declared as a human right, which is a story in and of itself. But certainly in the years and the decades to come, this human right to water will play a particular role. Will be quite important, if you would ask me. And this is a tangible result of what happened in Ecuador and Bolivia. Also, and I'll end the lesson here, is that if we look a bit back at our first example, the example of the bees and the colony collapse in the almond farms, and if we would try to apply the ecocentric view as proposed by Buen Vivir, what would it look like? And of course, I'm not a Buen Vivir expert, but if you would ask me, I think that the main argument would be that as humans we don't have a clear obligation to protect each and every bee that might die in the process of pollinating our crops. But what's clear in this example of the bees that are massively dying is that we have created a system that in and of itself is not at all reproducing life, is not able to sustain life, but is actually breaking it down. So the obligation that would arise from this more systems-based ecocentric view is that it would be our obligation to create such a kind of agriculture that can actually sustain a healthy population of bees. And there are different ways of doing it, and the pragmatics maybe don't matter at this point. But it would come down to creating farms where you can actually send your bees in, and that you can get healthy populations back out. Creating a farming ecosystem that can actually thrive and that can actually reproduce life instead of threatening it. All right, I've been talking for a while. I hope it has been a bit of interest to you. Anyways, if you are interested to know more, there is an interesting article which is also available on Blackboard by Eduardo Godinez. He's giving a bit of the baselines of the Buen Vivir philosophy. If you rather like listening instead of reading, there's a nice podcast with the same Eduardo Godinez in the Upstream series. You can find the link here. And then, as I mentioned before, there is an easy-to-read, it's a well-written book by Alberto Acosta, who co-drafted this new constitution in Ecuador. It's translated in English and also in Dutch. So that's also a recommendation for further reading. All right, I'll leave it here, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye.